Magnus crouched low among the dense ferns, his breath measured and shallow. The moonlight spilled through the towering trees of the beastfolk lands, bathing the forest floor in silvery patches. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his dagger, the blade glinting faintly as he scanned his surroundings. Somewhere behind him, the distant baying of wolves echoed, each howl a reminder that he was being hunted. He cursed under his breath. This was supposed to be a simple detour, a shortcut through territory forbidden to humans, a desperate gamble to shake off the bounty hunters pursuing him. Instead, it had landed him in deeper trouble. The sound of rustling leaves to his left jolted him. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he edged toward a fallen log, hoping to use it for cover. Before he could reach it, a figure emerged from the shadows. A towering, sleek figure with fur the color of midnight and eyes that glowed a piercing amber. "You've wandered far from safety, human." The voice was low, almost a growl, yet carried a cold authority. Magnus straightened, dagger in hand, as three more figures stepped into view, their forms lupine yet upright, bristling with restrained aggression. But it was the first figure, the one who spoke, that held his gaze. Lady Kyra. He'd heard tales of the matriarch who ruled this region with an iron will, her name whispered with both fear and reverence. Seeing her now, Magnus understood why. She exuded dominance, her posture commanding without effort. Her armor gleamed faintly in the moonlight, the intricate patterns etched into the metal marking her rank. "I mean no harm," Magnus said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Kyra's gaze swept over him, appraising. "A trespasser speaks of peace? Amusing." She gestured to her guards. "Seize him." Magnus tensed as the wolves advanced. He knew fighting them was futile, but his instincts screamed at him to resist. One guard lunged, and he sidestepped, using the momentum to throw the attacker off balance. Another swung at him, claws glinting, but Magnus ducked and landed a swift jab with the hilt of his dagger. It was a valiant effort, but brief. Kyra moved faster than he could track, her form a blur as she closed the distance. Before he could react, she had him pinned against a tree, her clawed hand gripping his wrist, forcing the dagger to clatter to the ground. Her strength was overwhelming, her proximity unsettling. "You're bold," she said, her breath warm against his skin, her sharp features inches from his face. "But boldness won't save you." Magnus met her gaze, defiant despite the odds. "I had no choice. I was running for my life." Kyra's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps? She eased her grip slightly, though her dominance remained palpable. "Running into my lands was your second mistake. The first was thinking you could survive here." The guards surrounded them, awaiting her command. Kyra stepped back, crossing her arms. "The law is clear. Trespassers are to be executed on sight." Magnus felt the blood drain from his face. "Wait," he said quickly, his mind racing. There's another way, isn't there? A right or a pact? Something that spares my life." Kyra's ears twitched, and her lips curved into a faint, wolfish smile. "You're clever. Yes, there is an alternative. The taming pact." The guards exchanged glances, their postures shifting with unease. Magnus swallowed hard. He didn't know what the pact entailed, but it sounded better than death. "I'll do it." Kyra's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. She stepped closer, towering over him. "Be careful what you agree to, human. The pact binds you to me. My will becomes your law. My world, your prison." "I'll take my chances," Magnus said, though the weight of her words sent a shiver down his spine. Kyra studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Very well." She raised a clawed hand, tracing a glowing sigil in the air. The magic shimmered and crackled, the sigil pulsing before sinking into Magnus' chest. A sharp, searing pain shot through him and he collapsed to his knees. When he looked up, a faint thread of light connected him to Kyra, as though an invisible tether now bound them. "It's done," she said, her tone final. "From this moment, you belong to me." Magnus stared at the thread, his mind racing with questions and doubts. But before he could speak, Kyra turned and began walking, her guards following. "Bring him," she ordered without looking back. Two of the guards hauled Magnus to his feet, their claws firm but not cruel. He stumbled along, his mind a storm of fear and curiosity. As they moved deeper into the forest, he couldn't help but notice how Kyra walked with an unyielding confidence, her presence commanding even in silence. The night grew colder, and the realization of his predicament began to sink in. Whatever awaited him at her estate, he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. The first thing Magnus noticed about Kyra's estate was its sheer size. Hidden deep within the forest, it sprawled across a clearing like an ancient fortress, its stone walls adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. The air around it was heavy with the mingling scents of pine and something musky that he couldn't quite place, a reminder that this was no human domain. The guards led him through the gates, their claws clicking against the stone floor as they marched. Magnus kept his head high, though the magical tether that pulled him toward Kyra served as a constant reminder of his new reality. Inside the main hall, the space was both austere and primal, its towering pillars etched with depictions of wolf-like figures in battle and ritual. Kyra ascended a raised dais at the center of the room, her presence commanding as she turned to face Magnus. She motioned for the guards to leave, and they filed out, leaving the two of them alone. "You will sleep here," Kyra said, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall. She gestured to a small alcove to the side, barely more than a nook with a simple bedroll and a basin. "You'll work for your keep, and you'll answer to me." Magnus raised an eyebrow. "And if I refuse?" Her amber eyes narrowed, and with a flick of her wrist, the tether binding them flared with light. A sharp, tingling sensation ran through Magnus' chest, bringing him to his knees. "Refusal isn't an option," she said, her tone firm. "The pact ensures your compliance. Consider this your first lesson." He gritted his teeth as the sensation subsided, glaring up at her. "Fine," he muttered, pushing himself back to his feet. Kyra stepped closer, her towering form casting a shadow over him. For a moment, her expression softened, though her authority never wavered. "You invoked the pact to save your life, human. I suggest you learn quickly how to make it worth something." The days that followed were a blur of physical labor and humiliation. Kyra made no effort to ease him into the routines of her domain, assigning him tasks that left him exhausted by sundown. Fetching water, scrubbing floors, and hauling supplies were just the beginning. Beast folk servants watched him with mild amusement, their curiosity tinged with disdain. Despite the grueling work, Magnus found himself drawn to Kyra's presence. She was everywhere, overseeing the estate with a precision that bordered on ruthless. Yet there were moments when she seemed almost human. He caught glimpses of her speaking softly to her subordinates, her touch gentler than he expected as she corrected a young guard's stance. One evening, as Magnus prepared to retire to his alcove, Kyra approached him. She carried herself with the same air of authority, but her movements were slower, as if weighed down by something unseen. "Come with me," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Curious but wary, Magnus followed her through a series of winding corridors until they reached a secluded chamber. The room was dimly lit by a single fire pit, its flickering flames casting shadows across the walls. At its center was a low table surrounded by cushions. Kyra gestured for him to sit, and he obeyed, the tether humming faintly as if approving his compliance. She knelt opposite him, her sharp eyes studying him in silence for a moment before speaking. "Do you know why the Taming Pact exists?" Magnus shook his head. "I know it saved my life, but beyond that, no. It's more than tradition," she said, her tone measured. "It's a bond forged through necessity, a way to ensure balance between two beings who would otherwise tear each other apart." Magnus Frovnid. Sounds more like a leash to me. Kyra's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Perhaps, but it's also a test. For both of us." The weight of her words hung between them, and Magnus felt the tension shift. Kyra's usual dominance was still present, but there was something else now, an undercurrent of vulnerability, as if she was letting him see a side of her she rarely revealed. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice softer. "The changes in the air, the way my people behave. Man nu snuded ketihusvi. It's different, heavier." Kyra's ears twitched, and she looked away briefly before meeting his gaze again. "The mating season has begun. For my kind, it's both a blessing and a curse. Our instincts become sharper, our emotions harder to control." Magnus stiffened, unsure how to respond. "And you're telling me this because? Because you're part of this now," she said bluntly. "The pact binds us in more ways than one. If I lose control, you'll feel it. If I falter, you'll suffer." The room felt warmer, the air charged with an intensity that Magnus couldn't ignore. Kyra leaned forward slightly, her amber eyes locking onto his. "You need to understand, Magnus. This isn't just about you serving me. It's about survival. For both of us." Magnus swallowed hard, his pulse quickening under her piercing gaze. He wanted to argue, to push back against the weight of her words, but something in her tone silenced him. Instead, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." Kyra leaned back, the moment of tension dissipating as she rose to her feet. "Good. Rest now. Tomorrow your lessons begin." As she turned to leave, Magnus couldn't help but watch her, his thoughts swirling with questions and doubts. The tether hummed faintly, a reminder of the bond that now tied them together. He didn't know what these lessons would entail, but one thing was certain. His life under Kyra's rule was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the estate's central hall, illuminating the intricate carvings on the walls and the faint glow of the magical tether between Magnus and Kyra. Magnus stood stiffly in the training yard just outside, his arms crossed as he watched Kyra pace before him. She had shed her ceremonial armor for more practical leather gear, her movements fluid and controlled. "You're here to learn," she began, her tone sharp and unyielding. "Not just about my people, but about how to survive in a world where you've placed yourself under my authority. If you're going to endure the pact, you'll need to adapt." "Manus smirkied feintli." "You mean I need to obey?" Kyra stopped pacing, her golden eyes narrowing as she stepped closer. Her presence was immediate, commanding, and Magnus felt his smirk falter under her intense gaze. "Obedience isn't the same as submission," she said, "and you do well to understand the difference." Before he could reply, she tossed him a wooden training sword. The sudden motion made him catch it awkwardly, the unfamiliar weight throwing him off balance. "Defend yourself," she said simply. Magnus barely had time to raise the sword before Kyra lunged at him. Her speed was startling, her claws swiping just inches from his side. He stumbled backward, swinging the wooden blade in a wild arc that she easily sidestepped. "Sloppy," she said, circling him like a predator toying with its prey. "You move like you're trying to fight ghosts. Focus." Magnus gritted his teeth, gripping the sword tightly as he tried to anticipate her next move. She darted in again, her claws tapping against the dull edge of his weapon with a mocking gentleness. "I don't see how this helps me serve you," Magnus muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "This isn't just about serving me," Kyra replied, her tone cool but firm. "The bond we share ties your survival to mine. If you can't hold your ground, you'll drag us both down." Now again, the sparring continued for what felt like hours, Magnus' arms growing heavy as he tried to keep up with her relentless attacks. Kyra barely seemed to break a sweat, her movements precise and deliberate. When she finally called for a break, Magnus dropped to one knee, panting heavily. Kyra stood over him, her hands on her hips. "You have strength, but no discipline. That will change." Magnus looked up at her, his chest heaving. "And what happens if it doesn't?" For a moment, her expression softened, though the dominance in her posture remained. "Then the pact will break, and you'll be left to fend for yourself. Without me, you wouldn't last a day out here." The weight of her words hung in the air as Magnus pushed himself to his feet, his resolve hardening. Then I guess I don't have much choice. Kyra's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. No, you don't. Now clean yourself up. There's more to learn today. Later that afternoon, Magnus found himself in a different kind of lesson. Kyra had led him to a private chamber filled with scrolls and artifacts, each one a testament to the rich history of her people. She sat across from him, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp as she began to explain the intricacies of beast folk culture. Our instincts are both our strength and our weakness, she said, her voice steady. During the mating season, those instincts become heightened. It's a time of vulnerability for all of us, even those in power. Magnus listened carefully, his earlier frustration giving way to curiosity. You don't seem like someone who lets anything make you vulnerable. Kyra's gaze met his, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something raw and unguarded. I don't have the luxury of weakness, she said quietly, but that doesn't mean I'm immune to it. The tether between them pulsed faintly, as if responding to her words. Magnus felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a reminder of the bond they now shared. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. Tell me, Kyra said, breaking the silence. Why did you really invoke the pact? Was it just to save your life, or was there more to it? Magnus hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the wooden table between them. I didn't want to die, he admitted, but I think part of me wanted to understand. Your world, your people. There's something about it that feels different. Kyra tilted her head slightly, her ears flicking as she studied him. Different how? Like it's alive, Magnus said, struggling to find the right words. More connected, more real than anything I've known. For the first time, Kyra's expression softened completely. She leaned back, her tail curling slightly around her feet. Perhaps you're not as blind as I thought. Magnus raised an eyebrow. Should I take that as a compliment? Take it however you like, she replied, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. The tension between them eased, the conversation flowing more naturally as they continued to talk. Magnus found himself drawn to the subtle nuances of her demeanor, the way her ears twitched when she was amused, the way her eyes glinted when she spoke passionately about her people. As the evening wore on, Kyra rose from her seat and walked to the window, her silhouette framed by the fading light of the setting sun. Magnus watched her, the tether humming faintly as if urging him to follow. You've made progress today, she said without turning around, but there's still much to learn. Tomorrow we'll push further. Magnus nodded, his thoughts a mix of exhaustion and intrigue. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could survive this bond after all. The day began with an uneasy stillness in the air, a stark contrast to the steady rhythm of Magnus' daily routine under Kyra's command. The tether hummed faintly as he followed her through the estate's labyrinthine corridors, their footsteps echoing in tandem. Kyra had been unusually quiet that morning, her usual stern demeanor tempered by a contemplative air that set Magnus on edge. When they arrived at the estate's western wing, Kyra pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a chamber unlike any Magnus had seen before. The room was bathed in warm, golden light, its walls lined with books and artifacts that seemed ancient beyond comprehension. At its center stood a raised platform with two chairs facing one another, separated by a low table. Sit, Kyra commanded, her voice steady but softer than usual. Magnus complied, lowering himself into the chair and eyeing her warily as she took the seat opposite him. The table between them held a polished wooden box, its surface engraved with intricate runes that pulsed faintly with energy. What is this? Magnus asked, his voice low. Kyra placed her hands on the box, her claws tracing the runes with an almost reverent touch. A relic of my people, she said. It's used during the mating season to deepen bonds and strengthen the pact. If you are to endure this, you must confront its effects. Magnus tensed, his grip on the chair tightening. Confront? That sounds ominous. Kyra's lips twitched into a faint smile, though her eyes remained serious. The relic amplifies the tether between us. It will allow us to understand each other in ways words cannot. But it also demands vulnerability, a willingness to bear your thoughts and emotions. Magnus' heart raced as her words sank in. You mean, it connects us mentally? Emotionally, Kyra corrected. And yes, to an extent. The bond already links us, but this will make it stronger. It's necessary if you are to survive what lies ahead. Magnus hesitated, his gaze flicking between the box and Kyra's steady expression. And if I refuse? Kyra's eyes narrowed, her tone turning sharp. Then the pact weakens, and so do you. This is not optional. She lifted the lid of the box, revealing a small, glowing crystal that emitted a soft hum. The light from the crystal seemed to dance in the air, casting faint patterns on the walls. Kyra placed her hand over it, motioning for Magnus to do the same. Focus on the bond, she instructed. Let the relic guide you. Reluctantly, Magnus reached out, his fingers brushing against the crystal. The moment he made contact, a wave of warmth surged through him, spreading from his fingertips to his chest. The tether between them pulsed more strongly now, its energy wrapping around him like an invisible thread. Images flickered in his mind, fragments of Kyra's memories, fleeting and indistinct. He saw flashes of her as a child, running through the forest with others of her kind. He felt the weight of responsibility as she ascended to her position of authority, her emotions a complex mixture of pride and burden. At the same time, he became acutely aware of his own thoughts being laid bare. Memories of his childhood, his struggles, and the choices that had led him here surfaced unbidden, each one tinged with the emotions he had tried so hard to bury. Kyra's voice broke through the haze, steady but tinged with a rare softness. You're holding back. Don't fight it. Magnus clenched his jaw, the vulnerability of the experience making him want to recoil. But the tether pulsed again, stronger this time, urging him to let go. He exhaled slowly, allowing the energy to flow through him unimpeded. The connection deepened, and Magnus felt an overwhelming sense of Kyra's presence. Not just her strength and dominance, but the layers beneath. He felt her determination, her fears, and the weight of her responsibilities pressing against him like a tide. Their gazes met, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted into something unspoken but undeniable. Kyra's amber eyes held his, her usual authority softened by a vulnerability she rarely showed. This is what it means to share the bond, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. To see and be seen, to trust. Magnus nodded, unable to find words that could capture the depth of what he was experiencing. The warmth of the bond lingered between them as Kyra withdrew her hand, breaking the connection. The crystal dimmed, its glow fading as she closed the lid of the box. Silence hung in the air as Magnus sat back, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Kyra watched him closely, her expression unreadable. You did well, she said finally. But this is only the beginning. The bond will continue to grow stronger, and with it, the challenges we face. Magnus nodded, his voice steady despite the tumult inside him. I'll be ready. Kyra's lips curved into a faint smile, her confidence returning. Good. Rest now. You'll need your strength for what comes next. As Magnus left the chamber, the tether hummed faintly, a reminder of the connection that now tied them closer than ever. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope that he might truly survive, and perhaps even thrive, in this strange new world. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the surrounding forest into the estate. Magnus stood on one of the balconies overlooking the courtyard, his thoughts lingering on the events of the day. The connection through the relic had left him feeling both exposed and oddly comforted, as though a part of him that he hadn't even known was missing had been restored. He turned at the sound of soft footsteps behind him. Kyra approached, her expression unusually calm. Gone was the authoritative stance she often carried, replaced by something quieter, more contemplative. She leaned against the railing beside him, the faint glow of the moon catching the delicate contours of her furred face. You've adjusted better than I expected, she said, her voice breaking the silence. Magnus chuckled, though it held no real humor. Is that a compliment or another one of your tests? Kyra smirked, her tail flicking behind her. A bit of both. The tether hummed faintly, a constant reminder of their bond. Magnus could feel her emotions more clearly now, a mixture of curiosity, pride, and something softer that she seemed to keep guarded. What was it like for you? He asked, turning to face her. The bond, I mean, the first time you shared it with someone. Kyra's gaze grew distant, her ears twitching slightly as she considered his question. It was difficult, she admitted. I was young, unprepared for the weight of it. The bond demands honesty, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the vulnerability she rarely showed was laid bare. But it also gives strength, clarity. If you embrace it, the bond can become your greatest ally. Magnus nodded, her words resonating more deeply than he expected. I think I'm starting to understand that. Kyra's smirk returned, though it was gentler this time. Good. You'll need that understanding soon enough. Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. A young beastfolk servant bowed low as they reached the balcony, their ears flattened in deference. Lady Kyra, the council is ready for you, the servant said, their voice trembling slightly. Kyra straightened, the authority returning to her posture. Very well. Inform them I'll be there shortly. The servant nodded and hurried off, leaving Magnus alone with Kyra once more. The council? He asked, raising an eyebrow. A gathering of elders and advisors, Kyra explained. They've requested an update on the bond and our progress. Magnus Frovnid. And what are you going to tell them? The truth, she said simply. That you're adapting, but that there's still much work to be done. The way she said it left little room for argument, though Magnus couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back. What happens if they're not satisfied? He asked. Kyra's eyes darkened, the weight of her responsibilities evident. Then they'll question the pact, and if they decide it's a failure, neither of us will walk away unscathed. The tension in the air was palpable, but Kyra's resolve remained unshaken. She placed a hand on Magnus' shoulder, the touch firm but not unkind. Stay here, she said. I'll handle the council. You've done enough for today. Magnus nodded reluctantly, watching as she turned and disappeared into the estate's dimly lit corridors. Left alone, Magnus found himself pacing the balcony, the tether humming faintly as if responding to his unease. He tried to focus on the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves and the distant call of nocturnal creatures, but his thoughts kept returning to Kyra. There was something about her presence that unsettled and intrigued him in equal measure. She was fierce and unyielding, yet beneath that exterior, he had glimpsed a depth of emotion and vulnerability that made him want to understand her more. As the hours passed, Magnus' restlessness grew. Finally, he made his way back inside, his feet carrying him almost unconsciously toward the council chamber. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve, but the idea of sitting idly while Kyra faced scrutiny alone didn't sit well with him. The voices of the council reached him before he saw them, their tones sharp and questioning. Magnus paused just outside the chamber, peering through a crack in the door. Kyra stood in the center of the room, her posture straight and unwavering despite the barrage of questions being hurled at her. The elders surrounded her, their expressions a mix of skepticism and concern. The human is untested, one of them said, his voice laced with disdain. How can we trust him to uphold the pact when he barely understands our ways? Kyra's tail flicked behind her, but her voice remained steady. He is learning quickly. The relic has already strengthened the bond between us, and he has proven himself willing to adapt. Another elder, a female with streaks of silver in her fur, narrowed her eyes. Willingness is not enough. The bond must be more than functional, it must be unbreakable. Anything less puts us all at risk. Magnus felt a surge of anger on Kyra's behalf, but he forced himself to stay silent. knowing this wasn't his fight to join. Kyra met the elder's gaze, her expression calm but resolute. The bond will hold. I will ensure it. The confidence in her voice seemed to give the council pause, though their skepticism didn't entirely fade. We shall see, the first elder said, his tone grudging. For now, we will trust your judgment. But if the human falters, it will be on your head, Kyra. Kyra inclined her head, her expression unreadable. Understood. As the council dispersed, Magnus quickly stepped back, retreating into the shadows before Kyra could see him. He made his way back to his chambers, his thoughts racing. When Kyra returned later that night, her expression was guarded but calm. She didn't mention the council meeting, and Magnus didn't ask. Instead, they sat in silence for a while, the tether between them a steady, reassuring presence. Finally, Kyra broke the silence. Tomorrow, we begin the next phase of your training. It won't be easy. Magnus met her gaze, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I wouldn't expect anything less. Kyra smirked, though there was a glint of something softer in her eyes. Good. Then get some rest. You'll need it. As Magnus lay in bed that night, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The bond between them had grown stronger, but so had the challenges they faced. And yet, for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope that they might succeed. Together. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the training hall, its golden rays catching the dust motes in the air. Magnus stood in the center of the room, his muscles taut with anticipation. Around him were various training implements, weighted staffs, thick ropes, and what appeared to be sparring dummies. Despite the equipment, his focus was entirely on Kyra, who stood across from him, arms crossed and eyes sharp. This isn't just about physical endurance, Kyra began, her voice firm. The bond relies on synchronization, body, mind, and instinct. If one fails, the entire connection weakens. Magnus nodded, wiping his palms on his trousers. The tether between them thrummed faintly, as if echoing her words. I'll keep that in mind. Good, Kyra said, picking up a wooden staff from the rack. She tested its weight before tossing it to him. Magnus caught it clumsily, nearly dropping it before steadying himself. Today we test your reflexes, she continued, and your ability to read the bond in the heat of action. Magnus barely had time to respond before Kyra lunged, her movements fluid and precise. Her staff struck toward his midsection, and he barely managed to block it, the impact reverberating through his arms. You're hesitating, she said, circling him with predatory grace. The bond isn't just a tool, it's a lifeline. Trust it or you'll lose. Magnus tightened his grip on the staff, trying to focus on the faint pulses of the tether. He could feel Kyra's intent, her emotions a subtle undercurrent that hinted at her next move. When she struck again, he parried more confidently, the staff ringing out as their weapons clashed. Better, Kyra acknowledged, her voice a mix of approval and challenge. But you're still relying on your eyes. The bond is stronger than sight. She moved faster now, her strikes coming from unpredictable angles. Magnus struggled to keep up, his instincts sharpening as the tether pulsed in time with her movements. It was as though her intent was guiding him, each pulse urging him to block, dodge, or counter. The rhythm between them began to shift, their movements growing more fluid as Magnus adapted. He felt the bond strengthen, a connection that went beyond physicality. When Kyra's staff swept low toward his legs, he leapt back just in time, her approval palpable through the tether. You're learning, she said, pausing to catch her breath. Her fur glistened faintly in the morning light, and her amber eyes held a spark of something Magnus couldn't quite place. He nodded, panting as he leaned on his staff. You're not making it easy. It's not supposed to be, she replied, tossing her staff aside. Now for the real test. Magnus blinked, confused, as Kyra approached him. She stood close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her, the tether between them humming louder. Close your eyes, she instructed. What? Close them? She repeated, her tone brooking no argument. Magnus hesitated before complying, shutting his eyes and gripping the staff tightly. The world around him became a blur of sounds and sensations. The tether his only anchor. Trust the bond, Kyra said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. Feel my presence. Anticipate. The first strike came swiftly, a sharp tap against his shoulder. Magnus flinched but didn't move fast enough to block it. Again, Kyra said, circling him. This time, he focused on the tether, letting its pulses guide him. When she moved, he felt it, a subtle shift in the energy between them. He raised his staff just in time to deflect her strike. Good, she said, her voice tinged with approval. They continued like this, Kyra pushing him harder with each round. Magnus began to rely less on his other senses and more on the bond, his movements becoming more instinctual. When Kyra struck low, he dodged. When she feinted, he countered. Eventually, the strike stopped. Magnus opened his eyes to find Kyra standing before him, her expression unreadable. You're improving, she said, though her tone carried a note of caution. But this is only the beginning. The bond has potential, but it's still fragile. You must learn to trust it fully. Magnus nodded, his chest heaving. I'll get there. Kyra studied him for a moment before stepping closer. The proximity caught him off guard, the tether humming louder as their connection deepened. There's something else you need to understand, she said, her voice quieter now. The bond isn't just about survival or strategy. It's about trust, complete and unshakable. Her gaze held his, the intensity in her amber eyes almost overwhelming. Magnus felt the tether pulse again, stronger this time, as though responding to her words. I trust you, he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. Kyra's expression softened, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. Then prove it, she whispered, her hand brushing against his arm. The touch was brief but charged, the tether thrumming with unspoken emotion. Magnus felt his pulse quicken, the connection between them deepening in a way that defied explanation. Kyra stepped back, her usual composure returning. Rest for now, she said, her tone once again firm. We'll continue tomorrow. Magnus nodded, watching as she turned and left the training hall. The tether between them remained steady, a silent reminder of the bond they were forging. As he sat down to catch his breath, Magnus couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The challenges were growing more intense, but so was the connection between him and Kyra. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of something beyond mere survival, hope. The evening sky was awash of deep purples and oranges, casting the estate in a serene glow. Magnus sat on the edge of a small stone fountain in the courtyard, the steady trickle of water providing a calming backdrop to his restless thoughts. The day's training had been grueling, but the bond with Kyra felt stronger than ever, a tangible thread connecting them even when they were apart. Kyra approached silently, her presence marked only by the faint sound of her claws against the cobblestones. She carried 2 wooden cups, the rich aroma of spiced tea wafting from them. Without a word, she handed one to Magnus before sitting beside him on the fountain's edge. Thanks, he said, taking a sip. The tea was warm and slightly sweet, its flavors soothing after the day's exertion. They sat in silence for a while, the tether between them humming faintly. Magnus could feel Kyra's emotions, an unusual mix of tension and calm. It was as though she were bracing herself for something. You're unusually quiet tonight, he said, glancing at her. Kyra's ears flicked, a small smile tugging at her lips. Is that so unusual? Magnus chuckled. Fair point, but it feels different. She took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Tomorrow is the bonding ceremony, she said finally, her tone steady but laced with an undercurrent of something unspoken. Magnus stiffened. He had heard mentions of the ceremony in passing but hadn't been told what it entailed. What happens during the ceremony? Kyra set her cup down, her fingers tracing the rim absently. It's a test of the bond, a way to prove its strength to the council and to ourselves. Her eyes met his, the intensity in her gaze sending a shiver down his spine. If the bond isn't strong enough, The ceremony will reveal it. And if that happens, we both face the consequences. Magnus swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. What kind of consequences? Kyra's gaze shifted away, her expression unreadable. Failure isn't an option, Magnus. That's all you need to know. The tether between them pulsed faintly, a reminder of the connection they had built. Magnus could feel her determination, her fear buried beneath layers of resolve. Then we won't fail, he said, his voice firm. Kyra's ears twitched, and she turned back to him, her expression softening. You've changed, she said quietly. When we first met, you were hesitant, unsure of yourself. Now, there's a fire in you. Magnus felt his cheeks heat at the unexpected compliment. I guess I've had a good teacher. Kyra's smile widened, a rare moment of genuine warmth lighting her face. Flattery won't make tomorrow any easier, but I appreciate the effort. They sat together in companionable silence, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Magnus could feel the weight of the coming ceremony, but for now, he allowed himself to simply exist in the quiet connection they shared. As the moon rose higher in the sky, Kyra stood, her movements graceful even in the dim light. Get some rest, she said, her tone softer than usual. Tomorrow will test us both in ways we can't prepare for. Magnus nodded, watching as she disappeared into the shadows of the estate. He remained by the fountain a while longer, the tether humming softly, a steady reminder of the bond he was determined to protect. The following morning, Magnus found himself standing in the heart of the estate's ceremonial hall. The room was vast and imposing, its high ceilings adorned with intricate carvings of ancient beast folklore. At the center was a raised platform, surrounded by glowing runes etched into the stone floor. Kyra stood beside him, her expression unreadable. She wore ceremonial armor, its intricate design accentuating her commanding presence. The council members were seated in a semicircle around the platform, their gazes heavy with expectation. Magnus took a deep breath, the tether between him and Kyra a steady pulse in his mind. He could feel her focus, her determination like a lifeline anchoring him in the midst of the ceremony's oppressive atmosphere. Step forward, the head elder commanded, his voice echoing through the chamber. Magnus and Kyra ascended the platform, the glowing runes intensifying as they moved into position. The air was thick with energy, the tether between them growing more pronounced with each step. The bond will now be tested, the elder continued. Through this ritual, we will see its strength and its flaws. Kyra nodded, her confidence unwavering. Magnus followed her lead, standing tall despite the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The elder raised a staff, chanting in a language Magnus didn't understand. The runes around them flared to life, their light casting an otherworldly glow over the room. The tether between Magnus and Kyra surged, its energy wrapping around them like a living force. Magnus felt his senses heighten, every emotion, every thought between them magnified. You must move as one, the elder said, his voice cutting through the haze of energy. Prove the bond, or it will shatter under its own weight. Kyra moved first, her body flowing into a series of intricate movements. Magnus hesitated for only a moment before the tether guided him, his actions mirroring hers with surprising precision. The energy around them pulsed in time with their movements, the bond growing stronger with each synchronized step. Magnus could feel Kyra's emotions more clearly than ever, her confidence, her determination, and beneath it all, a flicker of vulnerability she kept carefully guarded. The ritual intensified, the runes glow almost blinding. Magnus and Kyra moved together, their bond tested by the unrelenting energy of the ceremony. When the final chant echoed through the hall, the energy surged one last time before dissipating. The room fell silent, the council members watching intently as the glowing runes faded. Magnus felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, but the tether between him and Kyra remained strong, a steady reminder of their connection. The bond holds, the head elder declared, his tone grudgingly approving. Kyra exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. Magnus met her gaze, a faint smile tugging at his lips. We did it, he said quietly. Kyra's smile was brief but genuine. Yes, we did. As they stepped down from the platform, the tension in the room began to ease. But Magnus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their trials. The days following the ceremony felt like a strange, surreal blur to Magnus. The tension in the air had shifted, but it was as if a new layer of unspoken expectations had settled between him and Kyra. The council had confirmed their bond's strength, but Magnus couldn't shake the feeling that the true test was still ahead. Kyra had been more distant since the ceremony, her presence still commanding, but with a new, almost guarded quality to it. She was a leader, a warrior, but there was something in the way she moved now that told Magnus she was holding back. Something deeper, something she hadn't shared with him. As the days wore on, Magnus found himself training alone more often. Kyra would appear now and then, her silences more frequent, her eyes harder to read. He could feel the change in the tether between them, too. It wasn't the same as before. The connection was still there, but there was an undeniable distance, a space between them that hadn't existed before. It was on the 5th day after the ceremony when Kyra finally spoke of it. They stood together in the courtyard again, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the stone pathway. Kyra was seated on the edge of the fountain, her back straight and regal, but her eyes were troubled. Magnus approached, his footsteps heavy on the ground as he stopped beside her. Something's different, he said, unable to ignore the subtle shift in the air. Kyra looked at him then, her amber eyes sharp. It's not the bond, she said quietly. It's me. Magnus felt a twinge of confusion. What do you mean? Kyra hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice low. The bond we share is stronger than I anticipated. It's overwhelming. He stood there, his gaze locked on hers, trying to process her words. Overwhelming. Kyra's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. I'm not used to it. The way you and I are tied together, the way I feel every thought and emotion between us. It's more than I expected. Magnus was silent, trying to understand. The tether had always been present, a connection that grew stronger with every day they trained together. But it was true, since the ceremony it had felt different. It was as though their emotions were bleeding into one another, deeper than ever. I'm not sure I can control it, Kyra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I've always been in control, always led with strength and focus. But now, with you, it's different. There are moments when I don't know what I feel anymore. Magnus' heart clenched at the raw honesty in her words. He had always known Kyra to be confident, sure in her power, in her place as a leader. To hear her speak of uncertainty was a revelation he hadn't been prepared for. Kyra, he began, but she stopped him with a single glance. I don't want you to misunderstand, she said quickly, her voice firm once more. I don't regret the bond, but it's intense, the closeness. I didn't expect to become so aware of you. Magnus felt a wave of emotion wash over him, the tether pulsing as if reacting to her words. He had always known this bond between them was deep. He had felt it too, but hearing her voice, the struggle made it real in a way he hadn't fully understood. You don't have to hide it from me, he said softly, moving closer. I'm here, Kyra. I've always been here. Kyra's expression softened, the strength in her eyes flickering with something gentler, something warmer. I don't want you to feel like you're carrying this weight alone, either. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. I'm not sure how much more I can give. Magnus swallowed, his heart racing. You've given me everything, and I don't need anything more from you than what you're willing to give. She met his gaze again, the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes still there. She stood up slowly, her stance more deliberate now, as if weighing something heavy in her mind. This bond, what we've shared, what we've built, it's more than I ever thought it could be. But there are still limits. Limits I'm not sure we can overcome. Her words were like a weight on his chest. The tether between them throbbed faintly, like a pulse of warning. I'm not asking for more than you're able to give, Magnus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But I'm not backing away from this. Whatever it takes, I'm here. And if you feel this, whatever this is, I'm with you. Kyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked up at the sky, her expression pensive. For a moment, Magnus wondered if she would push him away, if she would retreat into the walls she had so carefully built. But then, she turned back to him, and her gaze held something different, something softer. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, Kyra said quietly, but I do know one thing. What's that? Magnus asked, his voice barely a whisper. She stepped forward, her presence surrounding him as she closed the distance. Her hand brushed against his arm, a touch that was light but filled with unspoken weight. I know I don't want to face it alone, she said, her voice steady, yet betraying a hint of longing. The tether between them pulsed once more, a quiet affirmation of the bond that still tethered their souls together, despite the distance, despite the uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with the weight of their connection, and Magnus could feel the pull of it deep within his chest. Kyra's presence was intoxicating, a blend of strength and vulnerability that left him breathless. And just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Kyra stepped back, her expression once again composed. We'll continue with the next phase of training, she said, her voice resolute once more. The council will be watching, and we can't afford to fail. Magnus nodded, his pulse still racing from the brief exchange. The ceremony had been a test of their bond, but what lay ahead was something more. A test of trust, of vulnerability, and of whether they could truly stand together not just as warriors but as something more. As Kyra turned and walked away, Magnus stood still for a moment, the pulse of the tether still strong within him. Something had changed between them, but he wasn't sure yet what it meant. All he knew was that the road ahead was uncertain. And yet, for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. The days following the conversation with Kyra had been full of training, strategy, and a quiet kind of tension that neither of them spoke of. The bond they shared had deepened, but so had the unspoken distance between them. Magnus could feel it in the way Kyra's eyes would linger on him before she quickly turned away, as though she wasn't sure if she wanted to pull him closer or push him farther away. He, too, felt the weight of their connection pressing down on him, but he refused to let it break him. He was determined to stand by her, to understand the strength and the vulnerability that lay beneath the surface. But there were moments when he wasn't sure if he was truly getting through to her. It was late one evening when everything came to a head. Magnus was in the training hall, finishing his drills for the day when he felt the pull of the bond again. It was a sharp, almost aching sensation, and it told him that something was about to change. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked around, sensing that he wasn't alone. And then, from the shadows, Kyra emerged, her silhouette outlined by the fading light of the setting sun. She walked toward him, her expression unreadable, her posture rigid as always. But there was something different in her eyes, something raw and untamed, like a storm just waiting to break. Magnus stepped forward, his heart thudding in his chest. Kyra, she didn't answer right away, instead stopping just a few feet away from him. The distance between them felt more significant than it had in days, and Magnus couldn't shake the feeling that the moment had finally arrived. I've been thinking, she began, her voice low but steady, about everything, about what this bond means, about what it's doing to me, to us. She paused, as if weighing her next words. And I've realized something. Magnus stayed silent, his gaze fixed on her, his heart racing in anticipation. He wasn't sure what she was going to say, but whatever it was, he had a feeling it would change everything. I don't know how to be with you like this, she continued, her voice cracking slightly. I've never been this close to anyone. I've never allowed myself to be this vulnerable. And yet, every part of me wants to hold on to you to keep this feeling. Magnus could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as if the entire world was waiting for her to say the next thing. His breath hitched as she took a step closer, closing the gap between them. You don't have to be perfect, Kyra, he said quietly. his voice full of emotion. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to trust me, to trust us. Kyra's eyes flickered to his, and for a brief moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to falter. The intensity of the bond between them flared once again, stronger than it had ever been, and Magnus could feel her hesitation giving way to something else, something deeper, more honest. She reached out then, her hand brushing against his arm in a gesture that was at once tentative and desperate. It was a silent plea, a request for something neither of them could fully understand but both felt drawn to. Magnus didn't hesitate this time. He reached out to her, his hand covering hers with a gentleness that seemed to surprise even him. And in that moment, everything else faded away. The training, the counsel, the weight of expectations. There was only Kyra and only him. I don't want to rush you, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I want you to know that I'm here, no matter what. Kyra nodded, her grip tightening on his hand just slightly, as if grounding herself in his presence. For a long moment, they stood there, the world around them silent and still, and Magnus could feel the bond between them surge like a tide. He could sense her uncertainty, her fear, but also her desire to finally let go, to embrace what was between them. I've never known anything like this, Kyra admitted, her voice barely audible. I've always been in control, but this bond has me feeling things I don't know how to handle. Magnus took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest as he reached up to gently touch her cheek. Her skin was warm, and the contact sent a shock of electricity through both of them. You don't have to handle it alone, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. I'm here, Kyra, and I'll be here, no matter what comes next. Her eyes softened at his words, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to lean into him, her forehead resting gently against his. The bond between them pulsed with a new intensity, and Magnus could feel her surrendering, allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way she hadn't before. For a long while they stayed like that, silent, connected. There were no grand gestures, no proclamations of love, but in that simple, quiet moment, both of them understood what had been unspoken for so long. It wasn't about control or dominance. It wasn't about power or duty. It was about trust, about allowing each other into the spaces they had kept locked away for so long. Finally, Kyra spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's ahead of us, but I want to find out. Together. Magnus smiled, his heart swelling with something that felt like relief. We'll face it together, he promised. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's presence, the weight of their shared bond felt lighter than it ever had before. There were challenges ahead, no doubt, but for the first time, Magnus felt certain that whatever came their way, they would face it side by side. And for him, that was enough.